Hey, Alec Miller, founder of Royals and Rogues, and today I talked to Aleks Sakowski. Aleks is a very skilled director, animator, compositor, and all-around digital shaman. He's worked on the likes of Guns Akimbo with Daniel Radcliffe, as well as producing and animating a number of animations for Moist Critical, Penguino, or Charlie, whatever you know him as, for various IPs including Plague Seeker, Godslap, and Skynet. One of my favorite parts of Alex's work is his ability to communicate so much with so little, also being able to really impress us visually and go all out when he needs to. And when he does, boy, does it slap. This is a long one, but it's well worth the listen. There are so many things we cover in this that I think are really valuable to artists. If you're a creative person in general, I think this is going to be a great listen. So get cozy, turn this on in your long car ride or working session, and get ready to learn a lot from this awesome indie producer. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Aleks Sakowski.
Big fan of the work. I've been seeing it pop up all over the place for a little while now, a few years, and it's I've always been like super impressed, and just with like, I think a lot of what you do that I really like is knowing where to put effort. There's like a lot of things where it's like I have a hard time when I'm working on stuff where I regularly will I want it all to look as good as one part of it. So there'll be like one part that's like we're looking really great, and then if another part that's, even though it's just like the intro or somebody's mulling about or something like that, it's like, well, that also has to be great. But you're really able to put kind of like your resources towards, okay, this scene, this section here really needs to be fully animated and have all the effects and details in it. But this like little opening thing here, it can just be like a couple stills that like go from one frame to another frame. And so like, I think that's a really cool to be able to exercise that. So I just wanted to kind of call that as something that I've definitely noticed. I'm sure you're intentional about.
Yep. No, definitely. It's a lot of it's, like you said, resource allocation. You've only got so much time and money or budget as well across the entire project. So basically, you really have to kind of pick and choose how much money, effort, and crew is going into that particular shot. Some shots are going to be super cheap. Other shots, you're like, there's $3,000 for effects here and $2,000 for animation, and it's got to really like shine. Sometimes you can get away with like really simple stuff. This shot's like one person's working on it, and there's no animation. It's just illustration stuff, and it's going to tell what needs to come across. So yeah.
I always try to. It's really interesting to me because it's a lot. Everything we do is obviously like smoke and mirrors, right? It's all like a magic trick to get someone to believe something's happening when it's not happening. And what's interesting is, I'm always trying to think in that mindset, but my brain defaults to like usually like the heaviest way to do something, if that makes sense, the most like costly way. Cause like, I work a lot in 3D, and so there'll be like some atmospheric smoke that needs to happen or something. I'm like, well, that should be like a volumetric, simulation. And it's like, well, you could probably get away with just having like some, photoshopping a cloud and taking out the background and then moving it subtly. Like it would probably be no different to the viewer. It's so far away or whatever. But in my head, I'm always thinking in like very literal terms. And then who I always love, of course, is when I find out that something was done in some really, cool, cost-effective way that just worked. And you're like, oh, well, I wish I would have thought of that, doing it that way. Do you have like a formal process to that? Or is it just like, are you sitting down, breaking down every scene? Or is it mostly just like, these are the tools I already know, and so that's what I think of?
Yeah. I think you always have to work with the tool you're familiar with. You can basically composite in 3D software these days as well. I'm just really familiar with After Effects. So, and because a lot of the projects we do are now more 2D stuff, it's all very like plane orientated kind of 2.5D kind of production. A lot of the problem solving comes about how to achieve a specific shot using two-dimensional technology in a way. It's easier 3D. You can kind of just, pick an angle and change the angle and keep going. But when you're working in 2D, you really have to be specific about why you're picking that angle or why you're picking that shot. You have to have, at least in my philosophy, a really good understanding of why you're using that focal length to begin with, and why you're putting that camera in that angle to start with, and then once you have an idea of like what's the action happening here, and like in the sequence, and what am I trying to get across in the most efficient amount of shots? Like, can I get away with doing this all in one shot, or can I get away with doing this in 3 shots? Is it easier to do it in 3 shots, or is it easier to do it in 1 shot? And then after that, you're kind of starting to problem solve, like, okay, how do I need to arrange these planes or these 2-dimensional assets to get that effect across? After that, like, that's the basics. You kind of see then my 2D breakdowns is like, we're always using grayscale planes just to see, like, okay, camera's here, this is how it's going to move. Then once you know how the assets are going to be kind of moving, you don't really even need animation in there. You can just have like blocked out positions. In my mind's eye, I can be like, okay, the camera's going to do this. And sometimes you end up with happy accidents later on down the line. Like, oh, that actually worked out better than I thought. But, and then from there, you kind of like, okay, well, I'm going to be able to use atmospheric 2D effects here. And that's what mostly we're working with, is 2D planes and effects elements that are being placed through the scene, depending on the kind of shot that it is. And those are going to be placed in depth. And the other part of it is your compositor's knowledge. In my case, I'm the compositor, so I've been doing it for years, is what makes a shot work. You know, like, what kind of environmental assets do you need? Like, because I'm across the entire board and I'm directing from the start and producing and also directing animation and doing the compositing and sandwiching all the work together, I have a really particular vision that I'm trying to achieve. And sometimes that vision isn't fully achieved in the previs or the storyboards. It's like 60-70% there. And as we slowly build, you know, I'll get assets back from like my illustrator, Linhan, incredible like illustrator, and I'll be like, oh, that's completely changed my like thought process on, like, you know, the color and the atmosphere and how this is going to work. That's all developmental process in terms of like, you know, why you're going to be using specific colors. Those things change and they slowly get refined as you go along. But for the most part, you're really starting with that kind of super simple grayscale like angle, trying to get the perspective correct with those grayscale assets. And then from there, the world's your oyster, because you'll know your shot. Sometimes it's very rare. I will need to create 3 or 4 different shots to try and get the sequence working. Mm-hmm. But in your head, I already kind of have an idea of like, this is going to be the most effective flow to get the action across. So.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I just talked to Peter Ahern, and he did a little short film called Buzzkill. It's really fun. I highly recommend watching. I think you would enjoy it, given your work. But it's all hand animated in 2D. And one of the things I think is interesting about 2D animation, as opposed to almost any other form of filmmaking, is I don't want to say it's the most intentional. Like, you can always be super intentional with whatever you're doing. But yeah. I sort of feel like traditional, you know, filmmaking is you're pretty intentional, but there's all sorts of things that happen that are outside of your control, you know, like the light on a certain day outside, or, you know, whatever. And then in 3D, I think it's mostly intentional, but there's this sort of freedom you have to change things on the fly. You really shouldn't do too much of that, you know, because the scope creep and all that. But I find myself all the time realizing, like, oh, if I move the camera over here, this is suddenly, even though it wasn't my intention, right? I didn't like plan this in pre-production to have it be this angle. It's sort of a cooler or more interesting shot, right? And there's a magic to that. And same thing on live sets, where you could have planned something to be a high angle, and you're like, you know what, let's just try this low. And you're like, oh, I actually really, that's more intimidating. That might be better. But with 2D, Peter was saying, you know, he's like, I try to like match the storyboards almost like exactly. Like, I'm trying to like plan the whole thing out. Because there's definitely this point of like no return, right? There's like a point where you've committed to drawing it a certain way, and then it's like, in order to change it, you're gonna have to redraw that entire scene. It's not like, well, now I can just move the camera over, right? Now I can just change the perspective, because things are baked. The perspective's kind of baked in, and it's interesting because it's like, I've always felt, I've never felt like that's a limiting on creativity, because 2D animation is often, I would say, like the most creative in certain sense, and usually some of the most imaginative. But it's interesting that it has to be so much more locked in, versus you would think without having all the, having all the freedom of a 3D camera, or having the freedom of being able to move something around on set, or tell an actor, say it this way, would lead to more creativity. But it's almost like, the world or the algorithm or whatever it is controlling, is dictating what's happening, rather than just your imagination.
Yeah.
So I don't know. That's always that's an interesting thing that I've been thinking about recently since talking to Peter, because I was like, I've done some 2D animation stuff, and I've my favorite thing in the world, you're talking about working with an illustrator, is like, if I could have a team and it was just like an illustrator and then me as an animator and compositor, and I could just crank stuff out, like that would be a dream. That's like that's like a really cool little partnership, which is this is going to take me on to another topic, but I kind of want your thoughts on that first. So, does that ring true to you about, you're kind of locked in, but then you're more creative in the brain space before working?
I think it was, I think Steven Spielberg said, I'm trying to quote him here, but he said every director should be an animator before they direct, or something like that. But because it's you kind of like process of understanding why you're putting the camera or action in a particular place. But
you can't use your gut as much as you would like to, because like I have somewhere back here, I have Framed Ink, right, which is like a famous 2D illustrator guide, but it's all about light and shadow, but it's 2D, right? So it's kind of interesting, because you're like, there is no light, and so I have to really, really understand light in order to draw it in a way that's sellable. Versus in 3D, I can kind of get away with like not understanding light that much, because I put it and it casts a thing, and it's generally more or less accurate. And then in real life production, like you can just go like, I'm shooting outdoors, the light's what it is. It's all accurate because it's real, right? Now it's not going to look as dramatic, right? But like as far as accuracy and then using that for dramatic effect in 2D, it's like you have to actually understand, like, what is this light doing? Where would it need to be? And then where are those shadows? Because otherwise you're going to draw them all wrong.
Yeah, I've worked across the field of production, features, TV, animation, music videos, advertising, and a big part of it is always like your kind of coming back to it is your constraint. Like you have to kind of work with what you've got. If you've got big budgets on features, you can really kind of like get away with more. You can start dreaming more and placing the camera in more complicated scenarios and more crazier sequences. But if you're doing indie stuff, you're more constrained to like, what can we do on the day and with the technology that we have. The beauty of any type of digital medium, whether it's 2D or 3D, is it really is up to your imagination and what you can achieve with tools. Like you can basically do anything you want. Especially with 2D animation, the world can be as big as you want or as small as you want. It can be as simple as you want, literally stick figures in black and white, or it can be as hyper real and detailed as you want, or in between. Doesn't matter. And you find that style that you're into and what you like to work with. But I think if you're going for any type of like world building, and that, especially as a director, you need to know which medium of 2D or 3D you're working in, because like there's 2D animation that doesn't really have a lot of realistic lighting, but there's a lot of mood, color, tone, composition stuff going on, especially in like 2D family kind of orientated stuff. And maybe the stuff that we're doing more is a bit more in the adult orientated, like in between that realistic kind of, but more graphic style, Western graphic anime style. And for me, my philosophy has always been, I come from a camera background. Like camera is my passion. I love camera work. I love understanding. I've got a huge understanding of the whole field of like photography and camera work and why you're putting the camera where it needs to be. And I think that's a huge part for my style anyway, is that kind of just, again, understanding. It's like turning a page in a book. It's like the camera needs to be that page turn. It's like you can't just place it somewhere because it just looks cool, or it's like I said, it's just looking cool from that angle. It's like, but different camera angles tell different stories and different feelings and emote, different focal lengths emote different feelings, and how that comes across in the production itself. But that's coming back to your question. I think the biggest thing about the best thing I love about 2D is you're not constrained by the world. Like with those projects that we made with Plague Seeker, Skynet, Athium's Way, Godslap, to do that in live action would just cost millions, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars, if not more, to get it to that level of production quality. Like maybe you could do it a bit more indie and like green screen stuff and spend a bit more time with smaller crews and doing a lot of green screen and VFX, but then you need heaps of like VFX talent. And but with 2D, it's really like the world can be scaled up to whatever. Skynet's a great example because it was kind of like the story started off really small. It was just supposed to be like one guy versus like one robot, and the story's kind of between those two. And I was just like talking to Troy and Charlie and just telling them like, to make this story funny or sell it, we need to scale this up. It needs to be like global, and this needs to be like a huge world, and with 2D you can take the same budget and just be like, well, instead of drawing just this one character, we're going to draw this like huge world and place it in there. So I think that comes with confidence in knowing your own style. Like you just need to really believe in like why you're doing it, and then you can kind of like get into that flow. So because everyone will have their own work process, and that's just my one. So
well, it's interesting because like you mentioned that, and I think that's a really good point where 2D is really weird to me as a medium, because I also come from like a camera background. These are all camera lenses and old cameras. I have my old Minolta film camera I'll break out now and then to take some pictures with, and almost all my lenses over here are manual. I even have, this is cool, it's an old little spy camera.
I got a little collection going on over there. So.
That's super fun. But with 2D, it is really interesting because you can switch. I don't know any other medium of motion like storytelling, that allows you to switch up your style so dramatically without feeling jarring, right? Like there's all sorts of things you can get away with in 2D, and I have theories on why it works, but there's sort of this like rule, right? Which is like the further you get from reality, the kind of the more you can get away with, but because like you could do like smear frames, and you can do like like you were talking about, like, you can have it be super realistic, or you can have it be sketches, but you can do that in like one piece. You can have one piece where like right before the character hits with whatever, it goes grayscale, and then it becomes like super sketchy and like, charcoal pencil drawings for like 3 frames, and then it goes back, and then everyone's okay with it. Versus if you do that with traditional filmmaking, it's really hard to pull off. There's a couple people that can pull it off. Guy Ritchie's one of them. But not a lot of people can really pull off doing hyper stylized to then very serious flat tones to then, and then especially anything with characters, when you're dealing with humans, we really know what a human looks like, and so if you're doing a realistic live piece, taking somebody and, stretching their arm or something just doesn't sell, in a live action piece very well. And it just kind of like, it just feels bad. It's like, I wish we would have done that a different way. And I think it's one of the reasons why people like practical effects, and there's this sort of like pushback against digital effects is, it's interesting to me because I had that question pop up recently, and I sat there with my co-host, and I was like, well, dude, like, does Up have too much CGI, right? And it's like, oh, that's a silly question, but it isn't, in the sense that like you could have something be completely CG and we buy it if it's totally CG. It's like, oh, that's great. But then when you have like a real character and then they do something that feels unreal, suddenly it doesn't work, right? But then in 2D, you can go, like you said, you can have like a very, very deep moving story, but that's very simply drawn and no one looks accurate, or you can have sort of like a Devilman Crybaby type animation style, and it works, even though it's like characters' arms are everywhere and things are moving in completely ways that don't make any sense to us as humans. When it gets abstract enough, we can kind of just buy it. We're like, that works. I get what they're going for. And to me, it's something like when we see things, we're not actually seeing them. There's the way the eye sees something, and then the way the brain sees something. And I think when you have an animation, the brain is filling in the gaps.
Oh yeah,
and so
definitely.
you're seeing it with your brain, and you're not seeing it with your eyeballs. And so when you're using your eyes to see something, and we're used to seeing like people with our eyes, our brain's not doing a lot of work, but then we can catch when it's off. Right? That's not right. Because you're doing all the work for the brain, and you're just giving it the finished image. But then when your brain is filling in all the gaps, it doesn't really matter how crazy the gaps are. Your brain can like make the jump. Right. It's like, okay, it's animating on twos. I can fill in those. I can fill in this character's arms here. It whips back there. I can fill in those. So the brain's doing almost all the, and it's easier for the brain if there's like less information for it to have to fill in. Right.
Yeah. 100% for sure.
Yeah.
No, I work like that all the time because of constraints on production and like detail. I'm a big believer that the environment itself is a character. It needs to feel alive for the world to feel alive. Like if the world is dead and there's nothing happening in the environment, I usually feel like the animation or productions are dead. You can't just have good character animation. The world itself in the background. Mamoru Oshii, Ghost in the Shell director, that's like one of his philosophies as well. And I came across that after I had already kind of thought about that myself, because what you end up doing is, at least in our productions, because we're so limited, sometimes it's like, well, the character isn't going to be animated here, but we can get away with putting some smoke in the environment here, or putting a little bit of like camera movement, a little bit of depth into this world, some fire, depending on the scene, just like little blinking lights in the city of Godslap for Defister. Like, the character's completely still, but the environment is alive, and that's what's selling those shots. So and I know that, like, I've spent hours on assets that are in backgrounds that I know are only on screen for 3 seconds, or if that, like a second. And I actually get a lot of comments sometimes, because like people say we have a lot of detail in our shots, and they're like, man, so much effort for like a 1 second shot. But once you publish it, it's online forever. People can pause it, rewind it. There's no going back once you've published that shot. So it's on screen forever. It might be on screen for 1 second, but and technically it's on screen for an infinite amount of time. But I'm a big believer in that kind of filling your brain feels that. You might not notice this little smoke coming out of this chimney in the background, or this little light blinking, or a tiny pixel motorbike that's flashing off in the distance. But as you're, focused in, you feel it as it comes across, and that's your brain filling in the gaps. And then you go to the next shot, and you've already got that feeling from the last shot that I am set in this environment. It's a big part of live action filmmaking as well. They tell you it's like you've got to really establish where your characters are, let the people understand where they're set within the environment. And the more you can do that, the more grounded the scene is, because the viewer themselves understands where they are. There's good examples where it doesn't work, like The Hobbit, where the camera is kind of flying around too much in a few action sequences, and as a viewer, you're just kind of a little bit discombobulated as to where you are in the actual setting. I find that happens a lot with modern day anime, and even though they're cool, there's a lot of these huge cool action sequences. The camera and the action is just going so fast. It's really hard to just grasp where you are and what's actually happening. Like your brain fills it in. It's like, oh, there was a big action sequence there and it was moving. For my own personal taste, I feel like you need the eye, like you need to let the eye digest what it's seeing. You need to let the viewer know. That's why in anime you'll see a lot of like pause frames, like slow motion pause frames right before the action, so that you actually feel that. Because if it was all happening in real time, you would just be like, I've got no idea what's going on.
Well, that sort of ties into two other really interesting things, which is one thing is I'd say like the art of the cicada scene, right? There's like these scenes where there's just cicadas playing, there's this like in the summer, the bugs, that make the sound or whatever it is. And it's like the cutaway scene. And I've sort of noticed we don't have those in a lot of modern day filmmaking. We've lost the art of the establishing shot, in the fact that like what's interesting is a lot of it goes a really long way. So like one of the things I said to do with a friend of mine. I was like, what helps a lot is if the first time a character interacts, a human character interacts with a CG character or item, like have it be real. Like have the first time they interact with something, they pick it up and they're like, oh, this is interesting. From then on out, it can be CGI, and we've already established that one shot, they touch the dinosaur's face or whatever, and then the rest of the shots, the dinosaur's 3D, which is like sort of the case in Jurassic Park. See the poster behind you there. You can get away with a lot when you establish the one or two, like this thing's real. And it's the same thing with an establishing shot. Like your brain keeps a 3D image of the scene. So like it's like if you show the outside of a building and then you cut to the set, my brain like remain like, oh yeah, they're inside that building. But I feel like a lot of like modern day stuff, like it's kind of crazy when you think about it, because so often back in filmmaking, that's like that's off. It's where we spent a lot of our money in effects back in the day. It's like, okay, we're in Egypt and there'd be like one very expensive composited effect, right, that with like different models and stuff, and then we cut in and you're like, okay, now I get where we're at. And I feel like a lot of times we're kind of forgetting that, because audiences are more educated, they visually literate, that you can kind of get away with that. Because back in the day, it was so funny, they would I was studying like Hitchcock and stuff like that, and people were like, "Oh, why does he have like 6 shots to get to like you would cut to a character in a scene, and he'd be like, okay, I'll see you tomorrow," and then you'd see him get up, you'd see him walk out the door, you'd see him get into a car, you'd see the car drive off, and then you'd see the car drive up, you see the character get out of the car, you see the character walk to the door, you see the character open the door, and then they'd be inside. And like nowadays, that's almost unheard of. You see a character go like, "I'll see you tomorrow," and then we just cut to and they thought if you did that, if you didn't have those like 8 in between shots, that audiences would just be like lost. It's like that's what the filmmakers believed at the time. Like if you just cut from one location to another without seeing the character leave the location and seeing them arrive, that audiences would just be like, where are they? Did they teleport? Like they would believe that characters had magical powers.
It's like modern day sci-fi suffers from that a lot, especially with space travel. They're like, we need to go to this place, which is really, really far away. Then it's like, boom, we're there.
Yeah, right.
Like, there's just no travel in between.
Yeah, and I think, there is a point to say like, okay, maybe it's too much to have a character say goodbye, open the door, walk out the door, go to their car, open the car door, get in the car, drive off screen, left to right, and they have to come on to the next one, right to left, right, or whatever, right? They have to go in the same like direction, and you can't break the 180-degree rule. Like that might be too much, but like getting rid of all of it is also probably too much.
Definitely. As you were saying, there's some good examples. Like if you think about animation, like Samurai Jack was a huge influence on me growing up.
Everything Andy Tarkovsky, man, I love.
But Samurai Jack is just such a good example of like, there are sequences where it's just like him walking, like, Samurai Jack's just walking and it's the environment and you hear the sounds and it's very particular. It's like, and then they'll cut to a next shot and he's in a different part of the environment. And some of those sequences go on for like a minute and it's just so beautiful because it's like this feeling that it brings across of like, and then boom, the action happens, some inciting incident happens and there's intrigue and you kind of understand that he's in this new environment. Blade Runner has a sequence, right, where you just have Deckard in the car flying around and they just have these shots of him like looking around at the world. And it gives you that sense of like, I'm in this world with him. I'm discovering it. He knows it and he's just looking around, kind of like we do when we're driving around the city, except in this scenario, it's new to us because it's set in a futuristic cyberpunk world. But those little moments, I think, are so important to that world building. Ghost in the Shell does it as well in the film, where you have that whole sequence where Motoko Kusanagi is just like she's on the ferry and she's looking at the world. And that whole sequence when it's raining and she's looking around, he's talked about it before. It's really important that it's like there's the city is a character. These people that inhabit this world are part of what make her and what makes this whole kind of story work. So,
well, especially in cyberpunk, right? Which is really interesting. In cyberpunk, like really understanding that the world is really the villain, right? Like the villain isn't necessarily the one guy or whatever. Like it is the system, the modern world, the like technology that's oppressively everywhere and you can't get away from it. And it's like, it's in everything. There's these cables that are constantly. And so you need to experience a lot of of just that natural world building. And it's funny because it's like Blade Runner is a fantastic example. It's like all those models they had to build the whole city, and like that's an easy shot to be like, look, nothing, no character is, the city's a character, right? But as far as like the producers are concerned, like no characters isn't really getting developed. The story is not really moving along. It's not an action scene that's going to like, be able to sell people on it. It's just an establishing shot. But you're like, I need that shot. That's a really important shot to have. And it's a very expensive shot, and it's one of the shorter shots, it's not the longest scene in there, but it's like, it's worth it to put in that effort. It's sort of like also when, it's a classic show don't tell, right? That's a number one like rule of filmmaking. It's why it's a film and not a radio play. But in it, you have Luke going to Tatooine, right? And it's like you see the mess of the town, and that it's like there's these little scampy things running around, and there's people just it's dirt everywhere, and it's not super sophisticated. And even the opening shot, it's like you could have opened Star Wars with like inside the ship, and there's a character, and they're like, we're under attack, and it's like by a much larger vessel, you know what I mean? And instead it's just like, let's just have the shot that slowly shows how oppressive this giant thing is. It just goes over the screen for like 12 seconds or whatever it is, and that just sets such a mood. And I do think like it's something that we're at risk of ignoring a lot of times when we're sitting here like, oh, let's just get to like the action shot. Let's get to the next thing that's interesting and gonna like move the plot or catch the audience's attention or whatever.
I think it comes back to also that like a good director knows how to get like, what am I trying to get the viewer to kind of feel or experience here? An example I could relate to my own work is like in Skynet, where we have the mega tanks when the attack happens at the end by the rebel resistance. My whole intention of that was like, man, we got to make these tanks feel huge. Like this is like a wall of siege tanks that are just lined up, and there's a few ways you can try and get that across. But what's the most effective way? And the most effective way is you have to be placed there as a person. We got to be on the ground floor. So we start with a shot of the drones running past, and you just see like a gray wall in the background. You don't know what it is, but then these platforms come down, these stabilizing platforms. The drones run past, so we get a sense of scale there already. It's like, well, the drone's probably a human size, so I can kind of relate to that. And then the camera pans up, and we see this is like a 10-story, 15-story size object, and the turret's starting to power up. And then that's already given us a sense of scale of like, okay, I know where I'm grounded as a human being. And then you cut to an aerial shot, and you have the drones running past, which are these tiny dots. And then you see the tanks from a larger perspective and zoom out a little bit, which gives you a sense of like, man, these things are huge. And then they fire. You go back down to ground level after that. But it was a very particularly thought out kind of concept of like, I tried a few different angles for that, and we tried one from the side because it's actually a lot easier to do a shot just from the side. It's like, it doesn't really feel that big. It just feels like tanks in the distance. So it's like, no, there's got to be a perspective change here. So that's just an example of like an intentionally thought out process to make it feel as big as possible, rather than just like picking a cool angle and going, yeah, that looks cool from there, let's just do that or something. So I'm intentionally thinking about trying to get that scale across, and that whole project was like, how do I make this world feel like immense and huge and that just over the top, So
that's a really good example, because one of my favorite contrasting examples in movie making is Pacific Rim 1 and then Pacific Rim 2, right? And like Pacific Rim 1, the number of shots they have to just establish scale is wonderful. Like there's so many shots that you're just like down here looking up as this thing steps over, and there's like a palm tree, and it's like way bigger than the palm tree, and you're like, okay, cool. Yeah. But like I understand how big this thing is, and the number of times you just get to see these things move in a way that's like, okay, it's not going to be this fast. And then like 2, they're literally doing flips. Like literally one of these things does a flip, and you're like, the physics of that make no sense, because it's so huge for something that large to do a flip. Is like, it's like watching a skyscraper do a flip, you know. And it could completely ruins the sense of scale and immersion and somewhat stakes even.
There's a good video that reminded me by Film and Stuff called Scale Framing, and they did it about like why Jurassic Park looks better than the newer ones. And it's a perfect example of the first Jurassic Park being somewhat limited in what it could execute with the technology they had. So they really thought about like the sense of scale, how these dinosaurs are going to come across from the angle that they're going to shoot. And then as you get into the sequels and you know, the new Jurassic World, all of that's completely gone. The sense of scale, the sense of size, why they're picking a specific shot for a specific sequence, they're just like throwing shots in there because they can, and they can just do it. They weren't limited. So they're, like you was like coming back to earlier, there is a sense of that limitation in your production can actually produce something of a higher quality, because you really have to consider why you're doing it in the first place. So.
Yeah, I think that's the key. Is I think the limitations force you to think about the why. I don't think, obviously, you could have a really giant budget, and if you're able to keep your why true, then you can make it work really well. And I'm hoping like the creator or whatever the newest film that's coming out is going to be that. But and there's a few other obviously big blockbuster films that are also great filmmaking.
I think Christopher Nolan does it quite well. He's definitely a very particular filmmaker. Right, you can tell in his sequences, like he's picking these shots, and he's limited by the weight of the cameras and where he can put them, and also he's not so into like huge CG and VFX shots. So he's picking his shots very particularly. So
yeah, I would say the first Lord of the Rings trilogy does a really good job of keeping their why. It's like, is this an accurate, not an accurate, but is this a spiritual portrayal of what we're trying to get across here? Is this a spiritual thing? You know, something on that tail, on that thought I want to spin off is like, you're not doing a lot of adaptation work necessarily, but I want to get this thought out in the world, so I'm going to say it. When you do an adaptation like Lord of the Rings, I think the mistake is we have to tell this story in a new way. We have to tell a new story. People have already heard this story, so there needs to be a new story in this new medium. And I actually think that's a huge mistake. I think what you're supposed to be doing is telling the same story, but in a new medium, because people haven't read haven't watched that story. Like, and the people that have read it are actually very, very slim. So is someone that's familiar with the work, you feel bad because you're like, well, I've read this and everyone's read this, so I need to be telling a new story. But when your job is simply to tell that story, but through a new medium. And I think it's a common mistake that a lot of filmmakers make when adapting something is, you know, they get this feeling like, well, if I just tell it the way it is, everyone already knows that. When, you know, with Halo or with whatever, it's like, I have to change
Cowboy
it.
Bebop suffered from that, right?
Right. Everyone knows Cowboy Bebop. It's like, no, they don't. Like, people that watch live action stuff aren't the same people on Netflix, aren't the same people that watch anime. And I know you're thinking, well, the audience that already has seen it, they're going to get bored. And it's like, no, they just want to see the same thing again. Like, trust me, like the people that love Lord of the Rings books love the movies. Like,
it's like you said, the adaptation has to be done for the medium, because how animation works compared to live action, compared to how book reads, is completely different. So you really have to understand how you're transferring that energy from a book. And Lord of the Rings obviously does it perfectly, and there's a few other examples, but Lord of the Rings is a great example because it's like, like the filmmakers understood what their limitations are and how they can execute the energy of what it feels like to be in that world onto a big screen.
Right. There's a lot of elements you can change, but the story should be the same. Right. The story isn't what you're really changing. What you're changing is how you portray that story, right? Like how you show whatever it is.
Cowboy Bebop is a good example because, like, I love the original animation,
right?
And that one's really about, it's like slice of life nearly stuff. They might be bounty hunters, but
literally, I'm wearing the shirt.
Yeah, exactly. And to me, it was like I could see in the original that animation, like that this is a story about life in general, just like the little bits of life in between the action and what they're doing. The problem with the live action was it didn't transfer the energy of what that was into what live action is. I can't really speak much for One Piece because people said they did a good job. I'm not too familiar with the IP, but definitely with Cowboy Bebop. As I was watching the live action, my first thing was that they didn't seem to understand the source material and what it was originally trying to get across in terms of the feeling and energy of these characters and the world that they sit in. And then the live action didn't quite capture that at all. It was like these action sequences in between these like goofy kind of like character building things. But it didn't, the original animation doesn't feel like that at all. There's like really deep character like development there.
Well, there's so many just slow moments, right, where you're just breathing. Like there's a lot of breathing in Cowboy Bebop where they just kind of let you sit with something, let you sit with the character's decision or the character's lack of decision or the the results of their, or just like what they're working through or just just fishing on the side of the boat or something for like a
it's kind of a film noir in a way.
Right.
And I think my favorite example that I kind of thought about was there's the bounty hunter infomercials, the adverts that they have in it. I can't remember the name of it right now, but it's a good example of like something that's super goofy and works in an animation scenario because it's kind of like you can get away with that in an animation because it's kind of the world establishes this kind of bizarre setting. But if you translate that one for one, which they did in the live action, it just does not work at all. It's absolutely cringe watching it. And even though they try to adapt it one for one to be like true to it, it doesn't work for the medium. As you said, you need to transfer it to the medium. And it's like, if I was directing, I'd be like, we need to take the idea of what this bounty hunter show is and turn it into a live action medium, which is like in our modern day setting would be more like, AR graphics, super snappy editing, over the top editing, not just like one camera like angle, and these characters performing this camp kind of like performance. It would work in a TikTok type setting, advertising, AR, streaming kind of like vibe with like commentary happening on the side, like over the top editing, motion graphics stuff happening. It's like if you did that and you adapted that energy, it would actually come across as like, I could believe this is a thing. It works in the real world. And when it comes to adaptation, I guess like Godslap, Plague Seeker, we've adapted them all from the comics that Charlie supplied us.
Yeah, I did kind of want to ask about those. What was the order of those, and how did those kind of come about? But you can finish talking about you're talking about adaptation, and we'll get into that. So like Charlie would come to me with the draft versions of the or the semi-finished version of the prologue or the first 15 pages and be like, we want to turn this into an animation. And again, anyone who's maybe read the comics and also seen the animations will see that they're not the same, but they're similar. Like I tried to capture the energy of what they were telling in the story and adapt it for my style of animation, and also like the 2D stuff that we're doing, and also like the energy and action and how to get that across. There's a lot of different ways to capture that and get it across, and obviously we had our style, but Charlie was super like accommodating and said like, you just trust in the process and like do your thing. And we would show him the storyboards and he'd just be like, it's awesome, just like keep at it. So I would give him suggestions. I'll be like, this works in the comic but it doesn't quite work in the animation. We just need to change this just a little bit to make the story kind of flow, especially because it's very like these things that we're doing, they're very short, they're very sharp. It's more like proof of concept trailers to kind of get across that this could be a world and it could be an animation, it could be a comic. So like Plague Seeker is probably the best example. If you read the prologue and then you look at the animation, the monster is similar but completely different. The world is similar, the story flow is the same, but the world that we've built is our version of that world, but still tells the exact same story. And that's kind of like what I like about adaptation is you can take someone's original idea and still get all that energy across with your version of that world building kind of with those world building tools. So yeah, the secret really is catching the spirit of the thing you know, and not necessarily the literal thing. And it's always interesting to me, especially with something like Cowboy Bebop, is like what they choose to adhere to or not. And you're like, well, why would you like, you know, there's things where you're like, okay, why would you completely change, you know, Faye or whatever, right? And then you're like, but then you're going to be super literal when it comes to like the stupid little bounty hunter thing, right? Like of the important things to match, right? It's far more important that the character is the same characters. That's what people love, and that's what they like about that character is the way they are and their arc and their attitude and everything like that. That's really what makes that story that story. And then the accoutrements and the set pieces, those are less important to get correct.
Well, there's a certain like swagger to the whole animation production. Like it's bebop, it's jazz mixed with kung fu and cyberpunk and like bounty hunting. It's this kind of, it's got this like swagger to it, which is really like a huge part of the original, which I think the new one completely lacked, especially in the camera work. Because I'm such a big camera person, I'm like, there was absolutely no swagger. They just like had heaps of Dutch tilts, but there was no like sick sequence design that made it feel like, damn, like that action came across like awesome, you know? Like
There's I mean, to be fair, he's incredibly hard to emulate. Like all of his stuff hits such a, I love Samurai Champloo as well, and that's like hip hop meets feudal Japan, right? And you're like, what? And it's like, there's like, imagine, I mean, you've seen Samurai Champloo, right?
Yeah. It's great.
So imagine the episode. There's an episode where the main Mugen learns how to like write. He can't like spell or read, and there's a graffiti battle that happens, and then there's also a character who's an aspiring like rapper, and it's like every time I watch that episode, it's one of my favorites. It totally works. It would never work live action. It would be the most cringe, like weird thing to have these twin brothers trying to like out spray paint each other. It just wouldn't come across as cool. Like them running across the rooftop makes sense because they're running like, you know, 500 miles an hour, right? But when you take a real person and you put them like running and then spray painting something, it just doesn't look cool. Like spray painting looks so badass in animation, and it just does not look that cool in real life. Like in real life, it's slow. It's just like these arc.
I think if you did it, it would really come down to your editing, and like I've seen some YouTube videos where it kind of works, but it's quite short. But that would come down to your editing skills.
Yeah,
and
it'd have to be like a Guy
so.
Ritchie type, you know. Like,
definitely.
Like I pop the can and it's a close up of an opening, and then you have the camera's locked to the spray paint bottle as it goes like right, and your camera's moving with it, and then you get like 2 more arcs, and then we just cut to it being done, right? Like, but you know. Maybe there's a POV shot of like the paint going over the lens, right? Like behind a glass. But like, you know, that's the only way to do that. You couldn't just like play it straight. It just wouldn't look good. So you're talking about working with a comic book artist. You said that when you kind of do those sorts of projects, it's very much so like you are directing, compositing, editing, and then you have a little bit of someone doing some illustration. Maybe you're doing some of the illustrating. Like how much of that is like a one-man show? What does that like team size typically look like?
It's changed between productions. For instance, like Athium's Way, which was one of the first 2D animations I kind of like tried, was just me and Linhan, my other friend. He's the illustrator. He's a super talented illustrator. I can illustrate, just not at that level. Like I'm definitely not like highly super skilled illustrator. Takes me like I can draw well, but I need hours to do it, not just like an hour. And then something like Skynet was me and Linhan doing maybe like 70% of the work, and then we had 3 or 4 people help out on shots here and there, little assets. And then once the budgets got bigger, like when we did Godslap, that was I think a crew of like 12 or so people. And then I'm still doing all the compositing, storyboarding, like pretty much like, I don't know, something like 60% of the work. And then Linhan did a huge sections of illustration, character illustration stuff. And then we had other people doing like animation. So that's when we started to branch out and have like, we've got like 5 animators. Each of them are doing three shots each. And they're, you know, those assets are then coming in. And then once we got into that flow, I think like for Plague Seeker, we had a similar, it was like 15 crew, but again, I'm doing huge chunks of the work. animating 3 shots. I think it was 2 or 3 shots myself, and then I've got I think it was 7 or 8 other animators, each of them doing 1 shot each. And that just allows you, like, I mean, 2 people, 1 person, as you know, like there's lots of people who are doing 1-person productions out there. It's just time, like time's always against you. And it's like, if you don't have a time constraint, then you can just spend however long you want on that. It's always good to have a deadline, but yeah, however long you want on it, to make it as good as you want it to be and get it out on your time. Sometimes you're, oh yeah.
I was going to ask you, can I have a ballpark, if you're not comfortable, it's fine, but like of what your budget would be for like a Godsmack or Godslap or Plague Seeker?
They've changed per production, but it's always around 50 to 60,000 US, depending on the length of it. But and that's like still considered low budget in terms of how far the resources are going.
Yeah, for sure. When you're talking about 15 people, right? Like this is something I want to say to the audience real quick. A lot of people think like where their mind is on what something should cost and what it actually costs are in 2 different realms. Like, so people always think like, oh, short film, animated, oh, it's just like a few guys. That should probably cost like $5,000, right? And you're like, and it's an order of magnitude more than that, right? Like it's going to, because when you have 15 people, and just do the math, like you think about like, okay, 15 people, an animator should be making at least like $30 an hour, but hopefully, a bit more, and then, let's say they're making 80 an hour, right? And then you go like, that's times, X many hours times that many people. And very quickly it's like, oh, that's not necessarily a profitable venture. That's what it costs to make. And then maybe we had scraped away. Like you have to have profit at the end of the day. So you can go home and like make another one.
And it's also a matter of, I want to be able to pay people for what they're worth in their time. And I'm still at a position, even with those budgets, where people are getting paid a lot better. Like me and Linhan did Etheme's Way. I literally did it for a car, like, because it was Troy's project, and he was like, oh, I'm going to sell my car. And I was like, I need a car. Do you want me to just give me that? And then Linhan got the rest of the budget, which was like $3,000 or something. And but for the amount of work he did, he did probably like $20,000 worth of work, and same with me, but where, I'm getting a like a $5,000 car or something. And then as the budgets got bigger, I was able to pay people more. But like, I know from the amount of work that they're doing, it's still like $10,000 short of probably where they should be getting. And you can only do that on huge budgets. Like, it's just the reality of it. I'm still happy to be able to offer them those that pay, because it makes the makes the work worth doing, because you can't just be like, hey, do you want to do, like, once you've done a few of these projects, you can't just be like, hey, do you want to do another 6-month commitment to this project and then be paid like $1,000? You're like, I'm not sure I'm so into that. But if you can pay people more, it's and also reduce their workload, because for like in Linhan's case, he was doing all the illustrations once, and I was doing all the compositing, directing, and everything. So the work was split 50-50. But now he doesn't have to do all the illustrations. He can focus in on just doing hero character art, helping direct character poses. So his workload's reduced. It's in a shorter period of time, but he's getting paid more for that. And if you're able to do that, it's a great feeling. But you're still sometimes coming short, and you always get that. So I get so many inquiries of people going like, "We've got like $1,000 or like $5,000." And I mean, maybe if you're starting out, like, don't say no. Like, if you're like a first-time filmmaker and you're getting these small budgets, it's always good to like take on what you can if you think it's gonna give you a chance to experiment. I did heaps of music videos for 5,000 New Zealand, which is probably something like 2,500 US, which isn't like heaps, but as a 19, 20, 21-year-old, you're like, I've got an opportunity here to experiment a little bit, and you still end up doing 6 months of work. But it's like, at that age, you're kind of, it's giving you a chance to find your rhythm and your niche and your style. Once you get to like 30 and someone's going, hey, I got $5,000, you're like, maybe pass it on to someone who's a bit younger.
I had an email from an ex-client from years back, and I worked with them a long time ago when I was first starting out, and I undercharged. It was one of the worst projects I've ever done. And I thought they like hated me. They didn't want to pay me at the end of the project. The project was good. The work I did was good, but it was just a mess. It was just communication issues and all sorts of stuff. And I worked my butt off for it, got it done. And then, yeah, they said they try not to pay me, and I was like, "You're paying me, sorry, too bad." And then years later, they reached out to me again and were like, "Hey, we got another project," and I was like, "I thought you guys didn't like me. I don't like you, but sure, I'll take a look." And they wanted like a full 3D animated character. The character had to do complex movement. They had to like brush their teeth. It was like a dental ad, and the camera was gonna like go into their mouth and out of their mouth. And I was like, "What's the budget for this?" And they were like, "Oh, like, we're hoping to keep it around like 1 to 2K." And I was like, "Dude, not only can I not do this, no one can do this. And if someone tells you they can do it, they're lying to you." I was like, "No, there's nobody's gonna give you like a full from scratch 3D character that doesn't exist and now exists, not just like buying an asset, right? That's pre-rigged, like then rigging the character." And then I'm like, forget it. And not only can I like do this, no one can do this. So that was my email back to them, and they never wrote back again.
No.
But
there's a lot of that out there. It's like 80% of the emails I get are you never hear back, because once you tell them it's like, here's the budget range for the type of projects you want, everyone's usually like shocked, like, "Oh, I didn't realize animation costs so much." It's like, it's just like live action. Like, it's super expensive to produce and time consuming.
A great screenshot of a conversation I had way back in the day when I was first starting, but even then it was still, they were still undercutting me. They were like, "Well, how much do you think this would be?" And they wanted a series of like 5 videos, 5 motion graphics pieces, and each of them were going to take, they were going to be a couple minutes long each. So that means, at least a couple weeks, if not like a month of work, And so they're like, how much does this be? I'm like, at the time I was like, it's like a minimum of like 1,500, and they're like, per video. And I was like, yeah. And they're like, "Thanks for your time." And that's like, I took a screenshot of like that one little conversation.
I had one person once offer me their IP
Nice.
As the payment. Like, it's like, "I'm happy for you to make this animation and you can own the IP as long as I'm like credited." And I was just like, "I've got plenty of my own IPs that I'm not working on right now." So I don't think so.
Yeah. And I'm like, "Oh, then you really believe in this, huh? It's going to be worth millions. Don't worry." But you can have
some people do. I think I said to my friend, if everyone thinks that their idea is the best idea ever, like, I think like that as well. I got plenty of ideas. I'm like, I'm a bit more pragmatic about it. I'm like, I know it's not the best idea ever, but I love like my idea, so I want to work on it when I have my free time. So
yeah, I always go back and forth on that, because I go like, "Man, this idea is so like dumb, and like everybody's thought of this, and every teenager is like, oh, this is so cool." And then I'll see what's out there. I'm like, okay, well, it's better than that though, right? Like that's what I have to remind myself. I'm like, yeah, my idea might be stupid, or it might not be the best, or I'm not like the smartest guy, but like, golly, I'm not, X, Y, or Z or whatever, right? That's like somehow got made, somehow is making money, somehow is getting renewed for a 3rd season. And you're like, okay, well, if that got a 3rd season, then my dumb idea, because I tend to compare myself to like my idols and the people I really respect. And I look at like, Ash Thorpe, or I look at Mache or others, and I'm like, "Oh, their work is so good, and my work's nowhere near that." And like, and then like, sometimes you should compare yourself to like, what's selling on Hulu or whatever. And you're like, "Oh, okay, well, I could definitely do, better than whatever that is."
What I found is I also get that. I think social media isn't very good for artists in one way. It's good for a particular thing, but it's also really not great for self-confidence sometimes, because every artist will have that battle where they like think their work isn't that great. I've made heaps of projects. I still think my work is amateur, and especially my own personal work with the Mechagenesis, this graphic novel that I've been working on. Is like, I get really like intimidated by just looking through other people's art and Instagram and robot designs and their versions. And I'm like, there's just like a million other artists like doing it way better than me, marketing themselves way better than me. Some of them aren't anywhere near as good as me, but just doing better because they're better at selling themselves. But what I learned over time is you've got to like drown the noise out, because the reason you're doing it in the first place is because you enjoy the process. Comparing yourself to artists is never going to help, because there are always going to be artists who are way better than you and way worse than you, who are still doing better than you. Like I said, like in the marketing realm, younger than you, older, it doesn't really matter. I think you need to remind yourself why you're doing it in the first place. Like, are you someone who's just chasing the clout and the likes, and is that your end game, or are you actually like interested? Like, what brings you satisfaction, the likes or drawing the image, getting the satisfaction of developing this like character you're trying to work on. And that's like a big thing for me, is like, as I build my world, this world of the Mechagenesis, at every iteration, the world gets more and more, like the resolution increases. I see it more clearer. Like when I first started, it was like, this is just characters sit in this world, but how do all these characters relate to each other? And then as the volume started and the drawings and story started to be told, I was like, I have a way clearer picture of this world. Like I'm the expert in this world and no one else. And that brings me satisfaction. Like once I get over those like artistic blocks and I start working on it again, because it's like a periodic thing. And I remind myself that like, it doesn't matter. Like I can post a picture and like 2 or 3 people will see it. And I'll be like, it doesn't faze me, because I'm really interested in like continuing to build this world. And every iteration, you always find someone who's interested. Like I turned it into started to turn it into a YouTube series, like audiobook kind of thing. And it's a very niche thing. Like I know this isn't like it's not going to go viral or be popular because it's like super science fiction philosophy based. It's right now it's just in an audiobook format, so there's no action. You kind of have to like learn the story. And not only that, the story's told in a Wikipedia format where each character has their own little like background, as you like go to Wikipedia and read about like, Michael Jordan or, or Elon Musk or some other character and learn about their history. But then as you read all of these little stories about all of these characters or environments or artifacts, you start to get the bigger lore of what's happening in the arc of the story. And like, I quite like that style of storytelling because it's helped me build the world. And then once I get to like, my goal is to get to 4 books and 100 assets, basically. So 25 assets per book. I feel like I have a great foundation to start to tell the stories of those individual characters in those worlds. And that might take me another 50 years, but I enjoy that process. It's very cathartic. It's, like meditative in a way. It's like getting this really complex ideas across that I'm into, like outside of work, like science fiction or astronomy or astrophysics or just like particle physics and technology, and where AI, especially AI, and the implications of how AI are going to change the evolution of our own future. And then turning those kind of ideas into a story of where I think it's going to go and try to have a unique kind of take on it.
Yeah, I'd really,
as opposed to all these other sci-fis out there. So
I would, yeah, I know. Yeah, none of them care about that stuff. But I'd love to have some conversations about that later, because that's all stuff I care about. My non, like it's still creative work, but I get my business. I guess a lot of what my client work is I do work for Intel Labs, and so what I'm always reading is white papers and technical papers on, quantum physics and on, qubits and stuff like that, and AI. A lot of it's AI, but it's like deep into AI. Not like there's a lot of like surface level conversations around AI.
Yeah.
And then there's some VR stuff. There's something about VR that nobody understands. I need to make a video about it because nobody understands this, and I'm in kind of a unique position to warn people. But it doesn't really belong on my channel as a short film channel. But the long and short of it is, when it comes to like Meta, right, and Facebook, they're a data company. Like what they sold was your information. That's how they made all their money. They didn't make their money by connecting people to other people, right? That was like the myth is like, hey, we made this great platform where you can all connect and talk, and that's how we make our money. But it's like, no, well, you made your money by selling people's private information to the highest bidder. And in the tech space, there's a phrase which is data is the new oil. So back in the day, there's like an oil rush where everyone needs oil because it's just so in demand. And right now, data is so in demand because you can only train AI if you have a giant pool of data. So who's making all the money is like, people that have either A, scraped all the internet and stolen all the data, or B, if you happen to already have a lot of data. So if you're like an excavation company that's been doing seismic scans for the last 50 years, and then you happen to have this giant background of data, people will pay you billions of dollars so they can train an AI on that data, right? So if you're like this is why like Getty Images has their own AI now, and Adobe Stock has their own AI now, right? It's because like, we have all these images to train it on, but that's only thinking image based. So one of the problems they're having with robots is, and I'm telling you all this so you can use it in your stories. And with robots, one of the problems is they don't have enough training data of like real world houses and homes. And so there's two options. They can either generate a bunch of artificial homes, or they can go in and scan people's homes. Now, it's really hard to go in and scan hundreds of thousands of people's homes. That's something, you have to get a really complicated device, which can see in 360 degrees. They have to be regularly moving it around the room. But what Facebook's been able to figure out is we can get people to opt in to scan their home and pay us for the privilege. And that's what these VR headsets are actually about. So the actual where Meta, I think, is actually going to make all their money is in having a 3D representation of many, many people's homes that then they can take and train and sell that training data to other places. So this is something that nobody's talked about. Nobody's mentioned that the whole point of AR VR isn't to sell you on a better version of Zoom. Excuse me. It's to get information, and you're going to scan yourself in, right? And so now they have not only do they have your name, not only do they have your address, not only do they have, but they also have like your literal face, your dimensions, your sizes. So what's going to happen is that you're going to get an ad, and the ad isn't going to be like, hey, buy this shirt. It's, hey, this is how you would look in this shirt. Right, exactly.
Did you see this morning the avatars from Lex Friedman?
Exactly.
And they had that conversation. Oh, they just posted it this morning, which is Lex Friedman and Mark Zuckerberg, 3D avatars scanned.
Yep.
And like you said, the consequences of that will be like, well, opting in, going like, I'm happy to give you my complete image to store in your data bank.
Right. They already have my name. They're going to know your height. Like the VR headset sits on your head, so they know how tall you are. They're going to know, like, you're not just going to get a couch. You're going to get an ad for a couch that matches your carpet, because they're going to know what your carpet is, right? Like, and they're going to know the size of your room, and they're going to know what's old.
You know how you were saying a character, you'd start seeing like furniture adverts with your room and the furniture, Compton.
How cool would that look there? Like, oh, that looks great there. Or like a piece of art on the wall or whatever, and it's like a little statue or something. So like that's really what's going on here, and I haven't seen anyone point it out yet. But I did want to point that out. How much time do you have? I don't know how long.
Oh no, I'm free.
Okay, cool. So let's go.
I'm like huge on nerd on AI. I'm like an AI enthusiast. I've been following it since I was like, I don't know, a young lad. Before it was, before the singularity was a buzzword. So I was always fascinated in this machine intelligence, and that's why I was such a big fan of like Ghost in the Shell when I discovered it, because I was like, oh, this is like hitting those topics as a young person, like about like what are the consequences of machine intelligence, and the Mechagenesis is all about that. But I could literally like it's a whole, like you said, a whole other podcast. I could spend hours talking about that.
Yeah, let's talk again about the nerdy stuff, because I think we could get a bunch of interesting ideas, because I have a lot of philosophical ideas too about, as we learn more about physics, I'm like, oh, okay, that makes sense why we're all crazy, is because we live in a quantum world, right? And due to complexity and uncertainty, two things can actually be true, quote unquote, right? Like a 1 or a 0, true or false. Two things can be true, and things can be true and false at the same time. So, but it's due to complexity and uncertainty, right? Which is the whole Schrodinger's thing. So anyway, and that breaks people's brains, right? Because people are like, no, did this happen or did it not happen? Was this a good event or a bad event? And the answer is both. It's both a good and a bad event. And they're like, no, I don't like that. I want it to be one or the other, right? So we'll get into that in another conversation. I wanted to talk to you real quick because, and we can probably wrap on this because it's going to be a longer one, but I get this sense that, I don't know how familiar you are with the comic book like history, and especially comics in like the late 80s, early 90s, and the whole like indie underground comic scene, right? And what happened with all that. And there's like a kind of an explosion and then various implosions. And there's like zines, right? And it's sort of this like punk rock, artist movement. And that's kind of where like a lot of things were born that we love. That's like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, right? It's like a fantastic example of a independent punk rock artist team of like two guys that's turned into a whole thing. And I sort of detect that there's this weird thing that's happening right now where I'm like, there should be this independent filmmaker revolution right now. Like there's all the tools are there. Like it's right now you literally can make a one-man, very high-end production in Blender, Cinema 4D, or Unreal Engine, right? And there's people that have made some really impressive stuff, but I haven't seen any. It's not what I have wanted to see. And what I'm trying to do is birth it. Essentially, I want to create or aid in the creation of, or just be a part of the digital filmmaking underground, as I would call it. And it hasn't quite happened yet, and I can't figure out why. Like, you're working on your own IP, and I think everyone has like their IP that they want to work on, and now there's almost nothing stopping you from doing it. And yet I haven't seen this like huge movement. Like, a Star Days was like a really good example of someone working on someone else's IP, but of like a single dude's really impressive work that, you know, was able to be crazy viral. And there was a point, like, I did the math, there's a point where he was making like $14,000 a month on it from his Patreon, right? Which is why like Games Workshop had to shut it down. It's like, that's too much for you to make off of our IP. But that's enough, right? $14,000 a month. I can run my life on that. I can run a studio on that. I can even hire like another person or so on that. So you look at that, I'm like, okay, why hasn't that happened yet? And do you also get that same sense that like it's bubbling right now? Like, we're getting there. There's enough free education. There's enough programs that are cheap. You don't need a huge team of people. And now, especially, I think maybe the final like straw is the AI motion capture, because like that was one of the big limiting factors of like having characters emote and do stuff, was like, well, you need a very expensive Rococo suit or whatever, that's a couple $1,000s, or you have to hand animate, which just takes forever. So getting that last kind of like little domino for me, I'm like, okay, what's stopping this from happening other than we're all lazy and none of us, you know, care enough, or we're all too distracted to actually make our own content?
So in a strange way, it is happening.
Right, I think it is. I'm catching the wave. It's my goal.
But the thing is, I think it's been happening for a long time, in the context that the internet, people are in bubbles of their own kind of like information, like in the context of like what you're consuming, what's recommended to you, discovering stuff. You know, people might think, you know, Charlie's like a huge YouTuber. He's getting like 1 million, 2 million, 3 million hits a video. But there was another YouTuber, like, you know, there'll be other YouTubers out there, like makeup YouTubers, for example, who are probably getting like 20 million hits a video. And I have no idea who they are. I've never heard of their name. And someone, you know, I caught a glimpse of it. I was like, damn, this person's getting like 20 million views per video. I've never heard of them ever in my life. Short filmmaking's similar in that context, where it's like there's just so much content out there, and it's like everywhere. You kind of end up discovering little bubbles of it. You know, some people are doing it well. Like Ben Moreau is like, he's doing his whole Huxley like IP, but he's also someone who's got like a relatively large following to start with before he kind of released that. Really well known within the like high-end art, like concept arts community. So it's a bit easier for him to like promote and sell and get that into people's hands using the whole Web3 technology as well. Another like example would be like, I forgot his name, King Pixels or something, who did the backrooms thing, where, you know, he did like all of that stuff himself using Blender, and cleverly enough throwing on a, you know, VHS filter onto a Blender render makes it kind of look retro and realistic. I can believe it, and people hooked on that because they like that kind of horror genre. Again, niche market though. You can get 8 million hits on a video, and you think that's quite a lot. It's only a lot in a small bubble. You know, it's like within the people who are actually like watching that. So it's very relative to the content and those people who are actually like, and how that content's getting to you in the first place. The other thing is, it's not easy to consistently produce like high-end like content, like in terms of like high concept content, because sometimes you'll end up just pandering to what the crowd wants, because you might spend I've seen with other YouTubers that I've known in the past, a lot of their thing is like return on investment. It's, you know, like Charlie's in a different kind of realm, because take this for example.
Is Charlie is that critical?
Yeah. So look at it this way: he can do like a 1 hour, like a 5-minute video, 2 camera, talking about whatever random topic or gossip topic or like event that's happened on the planet, and get like easy, like especially if it's internet drama, easy 4 or 5 million hits on it. And that's like half an hour of work. and do the math, like he's probably getting like $1,000 plus on that video back potentially. Or he could spend $50,000 on a production like Plague Seeker that took us 4 months to complete, and it only got like 400,000 hits because people aren't familiar with it. His face is not on it. It's just an idea that he's trying to sell like as an IP, and the general target market isn't. And within his crowd, it's a percentage of that, like 5 million people who are going to tune in every day or whatever. You're only hitting a small percentage who are going to see the thumbnail, go, is that like that's on Charlie's channel? It's a different IP. It's a different like concept.
So
doesn't perform as well. So
the problem there, right? Because obviously,
it's just harder to create original IP, especially if it's new and people aren't familiar with it. To sell it, you've got to really like put the groundwork in and like sell it over time. Like you got to commit to it, right? Like any IP really that's done well is or has longevity is constantly releasing some kind of content every so often. Especially indie stuff, like it needs to nearly be like back in the old days, like a publishing format where you're publishing content about that IP every so often so that people are constantly reminded of it. Because you might release a video, you've got 10 million subscribers, you might release a video, only like 5% of your 10 million subscribers are actually going to see that. So then you have to either talk about it on a video like 5 videos later, or you have to release another video on that content like within like 2 or 3 weeks so that another potentially 5% of your viewer market actually sees it. It's just familiarity when it comes to like original content stuff. And I'm talking like true original content where you've actually developed and designed the world that's not super familiar to people in the first place. Maybe it's set in a fantasy world or whatever it might, or a science fiction world or whatever it might be. But if you're trying to tell like a deep and original story that's not really like based on internet meme content, it takes a little bit more work and effort and determination. So
yeah, are you familiar? One of the things I think is might be the problem. I think one of our problems is the YouTube model might not be the right model. I think YouTube kind of screwed themselves over in this sense, and I think so has Netflix and other. I think all the streaming services kind of screwed themselves by they were insane with their under evaluation of what they should have been charging. Right now, it's because they want adoption, right? And so YouTube being free is what allowed them to be the biggest streaming platform in the world. And now they're running ads on things, but it doesn't seem to me like ad revenue is really enough to sustain any sort of production beyond the lowest form of production, right? Like a reaction videos or like you said, like pop culture topics or political topics, which is why all those are what YouTube's made of. It's really weird to me that YouTube's not made of what's interesting is YouTube's not even made of what it used to be made of, which is back when like I first got it started. It was like little lightsaber videos, fan projects. It was, short like skits and humor skits and stuff like that. And those are like not what would blow up anymore, right? Like what's blowing up is somebody's hot take or somebody's political thing.
That's the algorithm, right? Like like I was saying, that people get trapped into that algorithm where it's like, it's easier for me to do this type of content because I'm getting more views. And this is, again, coming back to the original point, which I made, is like, are you doing it for the views in the first place? Like, is that your end goal? It's just to make a living by getting hits on your videos. And obviously some people's YouTubes are like, orientated towards that. But if you're talking about stuff like what I'm trying to do with my own original content or IPs and things like that, and you might get people growing up now who are like, oh, I put a lot of effort into this little short film that I made, but I only got like 500 views. Is it really worth my time? It's like, well, again, did you enjoy the process? Do you believe in your end product?
It's one of the biggest dangers of attaching numbers to things. Because whenever you attach a number to something, there is this like monkey brain in us that goes like, number go up. And therefore, we don't know what something's value is. right? If I go, how valuable is it to, is that drawing, right? But like, what are any of the drawings behind your head? Like, how valuable is that original cell or whatever? And it's like, I don't know. And then someone goes, well, I'm going to put a number on it, and now it's worth $10,000. It's like, well, I guess it's worth $10,000, right? But like, it's not really worth $10,000. It's just if someone's willing to pay that for it. So
you just summed up NFTs. So
yeah, exactly. Like, that's a fantastic point, right? Like, that thing's not actually worth that, right? Like, so, when it comes to art, it's like art's really weird with its evaluations, because usually the second it's made, it's worth zero. It's worth negative. It's like, you spent all this money, you can't even pay someone to put it on their wall. They're like, no, thanks, man. Like, you're like, well, you want to watch my thing? And they're like, no, I'm good. And then as it gains traction, and especially after you like die, then it's worth like a ton of stuff, right? And so it's like this weird, like, very, very long term, and only if it's a success, and only if it actually works out, and blah 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 blah. With art, so by attaching views, like being able to see how many people see something, and then saying that that's a dictation of value. First of all, it's not. Like, that's one of the biggest mistakes is, we like to think, oh, that thing got 2 million views, you must be rich, right? And it's like, there are plenty of videos that have gotten 2 million views where the person's made no money off of them because their channel wasn't monetized yet. But it's that simple. It's like, oh, I didn't have 1,000 subscribers, and or they didn't run ads on it or whatever. And then there's other things you can have where you only have like a community of 50 people, but those 50 people are all very high net worth individuals, right? And so, if you ask me, would you rather know 1 million people with $1 to give you, or one person with $2 million to give you, right? It's like, well, I want that one guy that has $2 million to give me, right? Because that's twice as much, even though he's only one individual. The worth of his patronage is much higher than the worth of $1 million $1 patrons, right? So there's that. That's the risk, I think, of the whole YouTube thing, and getting paid by ads and by views. The danger of that is, you end up seeking after very low quality, or maybe not low quality, because people might take offense to that, but like low value viewership, when you could be having a much smaller, high value viewership. And so that's one of the things I think is really interesting about like the comic book area. And I think this is what we should imitate, is the direct consumer kind of mailing list that people used to have with comics, where you find somebody that's really interested in a niche that you're making content for that the mainstream is not making content for, right? And then that's what happened in the comic book industry, is more or less is like, you had the big two, Marvel and DC, and they're making like safe, for the shelf of, whatever comics. And then you have this indie space where it's like, well, if you want to see someone get their head ripped off, you're gonna have to go to the indie space for that, right? If you want to see something that's different, that's weird or wacky or funny or violent, that's gonna be the indie space. And now for me, it's like, if you want to see something just original at all, you kind of have to go to the indie space. And I'm noticing success.
Patreon is kind of in that realm, but again, that comes down to like, not all ideas are going to be treated equally. Like your idea might be better than this person's idea, but they've just done a better job at monetizing and marketing themselves.
Yeah. Well, I just saw someone like launch a Patreon with like, I think they only have like a couple hundred subscribers. But they make amazing work. They're really great. I should find this person, so I'm not just saying that, but I'll look them up.
I'm kind of like, I don't have any type of subscription service like Patreon or membership service, because like I like to make the work that I do in the time that I have. And sometimes I'll go months in between, like my own stuff, like the stuff I'm doing for clients like Charlie and the other animation studios I work for. That's all. It's a different realm. But when I'm working on my own stuff, I like to kind of just do it when I can. Yeah. And I always felt like if I ever had a Patreon or a membership service, I don't like the pressure of having to deliver monthly on something that if I'm not enjoying working on it right now, I don't want to force myself to have to work on it. I want to be able to do it when it's actually enjoyable. So I've always avoided myself in those scenarios where it's like, I don't want to have to be like, damn, I've got to like produce a page of the Mechagenesis, even though that might help in terms of like forcing you to do the work. But what I found is that I don't enjoy the work, and there's no point in me sitting there grinding my teeth going, I've got to do this because I have to deliver to these people who are paying me $2 a month. Just for me, that's not like a enjoyable thing.
I think it's the wrong model. I think that's one of our biggest problems with the indie filmmaking space is I think we have the wrong model. I think everything's trying to become a subscription. I think there's a big mistake to do that. But like clearly people have made and I know we don't have DVDs anymore, right? And that used to be a good way to do that because people understood a DVD is $14, right? And like, and so if you had a direct to consumer, you know, sort of Canon Films style piece, you could get away with selling the distribution rights or getting it distributed direct to DVD. You could make an OVA, right? You could make stuff that just like didn't really have the, you know, commercials, because people have been making all sorts of stuff for years and they've been making money at least to cover their costs, right? Not all of them got rich, but the idea that, you know, the only way to do this is Patreon and YouTube, I don't think is correct. There's a part of me that like wants to try like a bunch of stuff and see what sticks. I have a few. It's just
a responsibility, right?
Right.
You're gonna if you're getting $10,000 a month from Patreon, you have a responsibility to deliver content to those people paying you. And if you don't, they might start unsubscribing.
I guess my one of the things I'm curious about is like, I feel like there almost needs to be a distribution platform that isn't necessarily YouTube, right? So like one of my goals is to create this is, you know, I'm looking at different models, right? And one of them is like the Love, Death, and Robots model. Like clearly there is a market for digital short films, right? Or 2D/3D, both of them, just digital filmmaking. And it seems to sell better as a compilation. People seem to think they're getting more, like there's sort of this like, if it's not 2 hours long, I'm not really making my money's worth, you know? So there's a sense in which, okay, if you could get if you could curate a few interesting short films into an anthology of some sort, right? You could potentially drop that as a one piece that somebody could, you know, own, right? And you tie that into something else. Huxley's interesting to me because of the way they're selling it. And I really like that they're just doing something different. Like I don't, you know, I'm curious to see how it goes. There's a bit of like iffiness as far as like when it comes to anything that you're using a coin for, with the fluctuation and the valuation of that, and then the barrier to entry as far as somebody like actually giving you their money is like there's a huge barrier to entry there. But I kind of I'm looking at various models, and I think, you know, you've mentioned there's a number of things holding us back, but I think one of the biggest ones is lack of a great model for long form, like you were saying, like long form, non-monthly content, non-weekly content. Like, how do I make money now in the 21st century selling, let's say I were to spend, you know, a year and a half working on a 15-minute short film. There's a belief in my head that you should be able to make money on that, like good money to cover the costs at least, and let you keep living in a small studio or something like that. I don't see a reason why that can't be. I think it's a matter of figuring that out and then creating. I think one of the biggest challenges we have is creating the expectation in consumers that they might have to pay for content, right? Like, I think this idea that it's just free, and if it's not on my streaming service or my YouTube or my Patreon, then I don't buy it, you know? I don't see that as being necessary exactly. I think there's other ways to do it if we could get people educated.
Like my personal opinion on that is that I think it happens. I think YouTube on YouTube, that's like some indie filmmakers' dreams. It's like, you know, like Backrooms is one of them. It's like, you know, young kid making short films just because he's into it, and then it just goes viral, and you know, you get a movie deal. That's not to say that the virality of the content got him the movie deal. It's just that the producers or whoever was managing the IP got it in front of the right people at the right time. And whether it becomes a successful IP as a film is complete, because those genres are different. Like YouTube content, feature film content, TV content, they're completely different productions and production procedures. But like, I think it happens on YouTube. Like, YouTube is a good place for those filmmakers to kind of get discovered, but percentage wise, it's only happening to like 5%, if that,
well, yeah, that's always been the case. I completely agree with that. But what's interesting to me is like comic books seem to work on you. It's interesting. It's really weird to me. People will still pay money for a comic book, and as a digital person, as someone making a storytelling, you can create you can have your YouTube platform with like just a bunch of viewers, and then you can go like, hey, you should buy this comic, and then people will spend the money on the comic, right? But tell me if this seems weird to you. The idea of me putting a video behind a paywall and telling people, hey, I made this really cool video, you should go pay on, and people do it sight unseen with the comic books. Like I can name a good number of comics where people have made them and then just said, hey, so you should buy my comic, and they sell really well. And you're like, okay, people are willing to pay $20-$30 for a comic book, but they're not willing to pay $10 for like a short film animation like that, if they don't know what they're going to get. And I think we've trained people that video content should be free. Like, right? That's just been like trained into them. And you get a physical book. I do get that. Like there's a physical item you're getting. Yeah. Right. So I'm trying to figure out, like, maybe there's a physical item we could still give people. Like maybe there's like some sort of a 3D print that you can make of, like, you get the character and like a little thumb drive, like with the video on it or whatever, right? Or you get the link.
The production costs of that would just be astronomical.
Yeah, it's not so bad. I've looked at I have a couple 3D printers. It's not too bad.
I really like, in the comic world, like I really used to like those anthology type releases, you know, like Heavy Metal, or even like Akira started like that. It was a chapter within
that's exactly
a book of other
exactly
comics,
what I'm talking about. Yeah. So there's a part of me that thinks like, could I make a digital filmmaker zine? Is that possible? Right. Which is what Heavy Metal is, right? It's a comic book magazine with multiple stories in it. Right. So like, could you get some short film stuff going? And with the way, like, is the problem the distribution here? Is that what's holding this thing back? You know, the other thing I'm looking at to solve this problem is I'm trying to develop an open source IP. I think if you develop an open source IP, and like you said, now the IP is really famous, and if you end up making, that's why Star Days blows up. That's why anything Warhammer 40K related, just because, just any sort of Warhammer 40K film, you get views. Any sort of like Star Wars fan film, typically if it's decent, you get views.
Actually, this is one of the things that I think the short film world or indie film world is suffering from, is that to get those views, you tend to try and make more fan content, because you know, you're like, if I did an illustration of Iron Man, it's going to get way more likes on Instagram than if I did an original, like, you know, robot from my own world. So you do the fan art to get the likes, and then hopefully those people stick around to look at your own IP stuff. But that's like, if you're doing it the opposite way, like I'm not a huge person that does like is into fan art or does it, it's way harder to be like, I've drawn something that's pretty cool, and like, what do you think? And it's like 2 people are going to like it because they like your work, but they don't have no idea what part of this character is in this world and all that. They're just not familiar with it. So.
That's a really good point. I do think that's interesting to point that out. And it's weird, right? Because like, when I think back at like pop art, it wasn't that. Like, Frank Frazetta wasn't only drawing other people's characters, right? It's like he's drawing, you know, just unique stuff, and that creates like almost a genre, right? And you get other artists that are the same way. I can never pronounce his name. Hijima, whatever, Soima. I don't know. I'm butchering it. Let me look it up. Hijime Soriyama.
Yeah,
I believe. Yeah, and all of his like, he's not drawing someone else's characters here. You know what I mean? If, you know, there's Heavy Metal, like you talked about, right? Like, and a lot of Heavy Metal magazine isn't other people's IPs, you know? And so you almost need to establish a third IP, or not a third IP, but a third thing that's like, hey, this is where you go to get, like Love, Death, and Robots is fantastic at this. They've established that brand, Love, Death, and Robots, is going to be a collection of new, weird stories, and people are there for it. And so you almost need to establish either like a Heavy Metal, a Love, Death, and Robots type brand that then you can release things under, and the brand has name recognition, right? Which would be, I guess, Dust or Alter are doing this, right? And they're fairly successful at it, it seems like. And then the open IP is I think my best idea, which is like, you make an IP, the hard part is getting that IP off the ground. But if that IP is cool enough and people love it enough, and then you go, look, anyone that wants to make anything can do this, and I won't sue you, and you can make whatever money you want off of it. Like, that really opens that door to people to say, like, anyone who wants to make something in this world, it's a persistent world, and I have some ideas around that, but that seems to be like not a horrible idea.
I think one thing the short film or high concept short in indie industry suffers from is attention span as well. Is that long format content, people are happy to commit themselves to development of story, and short films really short form content is just fast enough that people can commit to a 1-2 minute kind of burst. But anything in that like 11 to like 15-minute range is in this weird kind of like, it's just not long enough for me to want to commit to that concept, and just too short for me to want to watch it in the first place.
So I see the same phenomena you see, and it makes no sense to me. Like I see that phenomena, but I'm like, in a world of shorter attention spans, short films should be like this is what I'm saying, right? Like, we have all the right elements for this amazing short film creative revolution, right? And it's almost like indie games are doing better than short films, and it makes no sense to me. Like, indie game developers are able to put in the work and make back their money. Why can't a short film do the same thing? I don't get it, right? Like you can do this. Yeah. It's not a AAA game. It's not, but people are still willing to pay $20 for an indie game, right? And then even though it's not a third, most indie games aren't a third the value of a full $60 game, right? They're like maybe a fifth of the value, right? Maybe a 5% of the value, right? When you look at like something like a Cyberpunk or a Red Dead Redemption, that's $60. Then you go and pay $20 for some like little trading card game, for Slay the Spire, and it's like those things are not even on the same footing as far as content and production and everything else goes. But people are willing to put the money in. But when it comes to short film stuff, for some reason, people are just like, I don't want to give you any money. And I haven't, like you said, I do think it's a perfect storm of obstacles, but it's also a perfect storm of like opportunity, right? Like, people's attention spans are short. You have the filmmaking has become cheap. I'm running a perfectly good camera right here. If I want to do stuff on camera, I have a graphics card that can simulate whatever I want. I can imagine, assets are cheap, asset packs are cheap. There surely is a way to like get this stuff out. And maybe it's a scope factor too. Like, maybe you could produce a monthly digital short film if you like limited yourself to
sounds like a sweatshop.
Yeah. Well, not a sweatshop, but like, let's say like for what you're doing, right? If you limited yourself to only, what's that called? Like animatic animation, right? Like, the characters aren't going to be rigged, quote unquote, right? They're not going to like do complex movements, but we can go like postcard to postcard to postcard, and you could tell a story monthly that way, perhaps, right? Like, I don't know, kind of like in back in the day in comics, you're like, well, this is going to be a black and white ink only comic, right? Because I can't hire a colorist, and it's too expensive to print a colored magazine, right? So this is going to be a 2D thing. I don't know. I do any of those sound like good ideas to you? And is there one that appeals the most? Like, between the idea of doing maybe a monthly anthology of different people's work, they're able to make a kickback from the work being in a place, and then you do like interviews as part of that package, and that's something you sell as like, hey, this month's episode is going to have these 3 short films and these 3 interviews and then 3 behind the scenes or something like that. That way you're adding value, quote unquote, to the viewers. Like, oh, I'm not just buying a short film, I'm buying like this little package, and then maybe it comes with like some original prints and stuff to have a physical item that you could like ship out for cheap, right? Or
it can all work. Like you were saying before, it's like how would AI affect that? And like you said, there's already like millions and millions of content creators out there, and then now there's going to be millions and millions of bot creators out there, and the market itself dilutes a bit, where it's just like an overflow of information. But again, you focus in on that audience that you slowly build over time, and some audiences take longer to build, others are overnight like successes. And for me, regardless of whether you're doing like what those formats you're talking about, whether you're using YouTube or Patreon or whatever subscription service you're trying, it always comes down to whether you're enjoying the process yourself. Like, do you enjoy curating? Is that the thing you want to do? Do you enjoy doing the illustration? Do you enjoy doing the directing and all that kind of stuff? For me, it's always been like, I've noticed that in the industry, it's like talent is not enough. You can't just be good at what you do and make good stuff. What's going to get you there is determination. Like if you're truly determined, because at the end of the day, short films were always first of all a stepping stone to get to feature films.
Yeah, I
but
don't
that's
like
incredibly.
that. I've never liked that. That's really bothered me for a long time.
It's incredibly difficult to get into to get into that industry in the first place as a director anyway. Like you really have to grind and make sure you're getting yourself in front of the right people. And at the end of the day, it really comes down to whether you're making a monetary success on the content you're producing in the short film market, because short film market is completely different to the online short film market, like the festival circuits and all of that kind of physical, like in-person cinema experience stuff. Like they're two completely separate, different. Like your film might be doing super well in the festival market, like and getting into like all of the big festivals, but online it's got like 10,000 views. It's like a completely different like ball game.
Well, yeah, so, because there's gatekeepers, right? So one is, are you making something the gatekeepers are going to enjoy, or are you making something that the population just enjoys, right? And those are two very different audiences, right? Because when it comes to the short film market, is film festivals, they all have a board, and the board is reviewing, and the board decides, okay, here's what gets in and here's what doesn't, right? I
should know because I run a film festival as well.
yeah. So that's a completely different market, right? Like you were saying, like then, and which is why they can do vastly different numbers, right? You could have a very, like you said, successful in terms of getting into, high competition festivals, but then do horrendously online because you're
it's different.
A niche subject.
In person, especially like with the film festival I run, it's, we're not like going to be getting projects that are getting millions of hits online, maybe one or two niche projects here and there. But what the whole point of that festival anyway is that physical in-person recognition of people's works, especially in the local community that's like that we're kind of targeting. It's a totally different experience than like, oh yeah, my video got like 500,000 views, but you might see the online buzz about it, but it's totally different when you're actually in person showing it to a cinema audience and then getting to talk to those people after the fact and network with people and like actually interact with like people one-on-one, particularly about your project, especially if you're an indie creator. If you're already successful, it's like in the online spectrum, it doesn't matter because you're probably already doing meet and greets and things like that. But for indie filmmakers, so it's like their second film that they've got into a festival, or students or anyone like that, or experimentalists who are just trying stuff. It's like you can see how proud they are in the moment when they receive recognition, even if they don't win an award. It's just like all of that effort that I put into it was worth it, even if only the cinema here are the only people that are going to see it. It's just like you can really see like that kind of energy gets through. So
yeah, that kind of ties back to the danger of tying views to success, right? Where like maybe your view of success is getting that emotion across that you are trying to get across in somebody else. Like that could be the reward. And I do think like I'm in no way, anti money or anti, even capitalism for that matter, but I am very, very, very against the idea that monetary value is the only value things have. I think that's completely and utterly false. I think the monetary value is supposed to reflect the real value it has, which could be any number of reasons, right? It could be valuable because the love was put into it. It could be valuable because it was your grandma's or your grandpa's, and that's a personal attachment, and to you it's worth the world, right? There's no monetary value in a marketplace for that, but to you as an individual it's really, really valuable. So the idea that if I make a film and let's say it's about I don't know, trauma or something, helps one person process that, that might not be really valuable, quote unquote, in a marketplace, but it's insanely valuable to that one person. I helped, or I gave air to somebody's, plight or to struggle, to something that they've always felt, and it's really interesting to me because, it's weird because again, there's this weird idea that like, oh, your art's not worth anything. And, why are you making art and all this other stuff? And there's so many practical things. You're going to be a starving artist, but it's like, I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say, not to me, because I haven't made that much stuff, but to people, like, your book or your art or even your YouTube channel got me through my surgery, got me through my whatever. And there's this weird sense that, like, beauty, and in beauty can be like a really ugly monster, right? Like there's the idea of creativity and beauty is what makes life worth living, right? Like, and so it's sort of a shame. I like the fact that it's more accessible for sure, but the idea of devaluing it to the point of, like, it's all free, everyone, we're gonna overfeed you with it online, and then the value of it is as how many people saw it is, like, such a disservice, like, to any sort of art or any sort of creativity. I'd much rather,
especially those kind of like gems that, like, you can see that it's like high quality content, but it's not really being, like, seen by people. But I think if you do what you love, you will eventually find your audience one way or another, even if it takes you like 20 years. Like, again, it comes down to whether you're chasing just the clout, or if you're actually doing it because you love the process and you believe in your idea. Because a lot of people just won't care. But you have to ask yourself, are you trying to make a living off this thing, or are you doing it as a hobby, personal kind of project kind of thing? And lots of people would love to make money off their personal art, like, but the reality of it is it's going to be a small percentage that do, because it's a tough industry to crack that way. And as we're saying, that reciprocating kind of like feedback loop is like, you'll start doing stuff for the crowd rather than, you see it with a lot of YouTube content, a lot of YouTube creators, that this did really well, so I'm going to start working towards that. And what's to say that YouTube isn't trying to, like, design that algorithm to force you to create that kind of content just to retain attention? That's all it is, just to retain people's attention. So, and I've got this philosophy on modern day attention and what it actually is. Basically, like, just to spiel about it quickly, is that attention is basically a currency now. You only have so much of it per day. Like, you can only allocate so much of your attention to everything in your life, your partner, your child, your job, your hobby, eating, cleanliness, all of that stuff requires attention, right? And social media is fighting for that attention as much as possible. It is dying for it. It needs it. It needs to retain it, and it requires you to be there paying attention, which kind of not. You scroll through Instagram or whatever, Twitter, how much of that stuff are you actually retaining? Like a 1%, if you're lucky, you might remember, like, I saw this thing on, like, Twitter, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, the thing with attention is it can be focused, right? If you're one of those lucky people that learns how to focus their attention, you will discover that if you focus your attention on a specific thing over a long period of time, you can create these huge worlds, right? Like, just taking an example like Godslap or animation and something, that is a group of us focusing our attention on this one thing for whatever it is, for X amount of hours per day, whatever you can allocate to it per day, over a period of time. And then you produce this thing, and then you go, here's what happens when I focus my attention on the particular thing. Now, that's across the board. Your relationship requires attention. If you don't give it attention, it will fail. If you give it the right type of attention, it will blossom. Your children, anything like that's worth anything basically in life requires you to invest some of that. But now just remember, it's like gaming, right? Like I actually got this from gaming, because I used to game a lot more than I do now. And obviously, as a 20-year-old, yes, there are days easy I can go 6-8 hours longer gaming, Team Fortress, like nonstop.
So
and I loved it. And then after a while, I was like, you know what? My Steam's telling me I've spent 42 hours in the last hour, kind of context, like in the 42 hours in the last 3 days gaming, but I've spent no time on this project that I really, really want to do. And I'm wondering why I'm not finishing it. I'm like, if I spent the same amount of attention on that project, or at least an hour would be enough, or even that, like 5 minutes.
Well, and that's the painful truth, right? The lie is like, oh, it doesn't really matter. And it's like, no, you really do only have 24 hours. You really do only have the one life, and you really only do have the time you have. And whatever it is you practice, you get better at. And it's like, it's an uncomfortable truth, but that is like completely true.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. So if you learn that focused attention is actually one of the most valuable things you can have in your life, and like conscious attention, not just like that's the problem with social media, is it's not conscious attention. It's attention. It's real time attention. It retains you in the moment. But then as soon as you're off it, it's like, it's gone. Like, again, you might retain something like, oh, I saw this thing, or I read this thing, and so on and so on. But especially like Twitter, Facebook, all of those types of scrolling platforms, their job is to keep you there and for as much time as they can.
Well, and
especially
not just
TikTok,
for as
right?
much time, but they're so dirty, because what they do is they are able to capitalize on any moment where something isn't a priority of your attention, right? So like, I'm not like crazy addicted, right? But like, so if I'm with my wife, or if I'm with my friends, my family, or a nephew or a niece or something, they're getting my full attention. But for me, what's so dirty about them is like, I'm rendering something, and I go like, well, I don't need to pay attention to this render bar moving to the right. So I'll shoot up, social media. And then what it's doing is it's adding a tax to any time you don't have attention being taken by something else, right? So then you get this attention tax of like, oh, well, that render finished, but you're still going to scroll for like another 3 minutes, right? Or it's like, oh, you went to the bathroom, right? And you're done, but you're still going to scroll for another couple, whatever, because, it's like, well, and
it's
then,
easy. That's the thing. It's easy. And then you don't have to think in a way. So.
The other thing about it is they're like, oh, it's low value and whatnot. But like, we've figured out a way to trick the smart people as well. And that's the dirty part. I was talking to a friend of mine about this, and he was pushing back on it, but I'm right and he's wrong. And it's, we trick the smart people into giving up their attention with long form podcasts. So all the smart people go, well, I'm not wasting time, right? I'm paying attention to something important, a conversation about the state of the world, or about, geopolitical events, or about, whatever it is, some big idea. So we trick people who are smart and don't fall for because they're like, no, I don't watch those trashy TikToks. I don't watch those trashy short, for my attention span's long. I watch 3 hours of content. And you're like, dude, you spent 3 hours watching somebody talk about something. And I know you're like, well, I have it on the background, but it's like, come on, like, you're still, you know what I mean? Like that, I would have rather you spent that 3 hours working on your book and actively, or whatever.
So like there is a place for entertainment, attention, like your brain needs to relax. But what I definitely see in a modern setting now is that, even obviously we all suffer from it. I do it. We all do it probably now, where you're watching this movie and you'll just start scrolling through your film while you're watching scrolling through your phone, and you don't really need to, because like it's just garbage. If you're bored by this, then you're getting bored by the next thing on your phone or whatever. But it's that ability to retain the attention that's the tricky part. Like I think we struggle in a modern era to do that, because we've been trained to just quickly look at our phone. Now, I've been more conscious of this recently, so I've been trying to avoid it and be more present in the moment on the thing that I'm doing. I still do it, and I think naturally we will. But something that's helped is I've just reduced like my Facebook time that I use it. Actually, like I took a complete break from it in the last week, and it was great. It's like everyone's always going to say it's great, but there's this, sense that you're missing out on something, but really you're not.
I think we're all on the same like wavelength with this. There's a lot of, especially everyone in the creative space, I think is all feeling like I can't be creative properly. And like, especially for people like us, we're like, I used to love just sitting and watching a film, lights off, and nothing. I would just fully immerse. And even if I'm breaking down what the scene is, what the lighting is like, but now I'm like pulling up this halfway through, and it's like, okay, that's not right. That's not who I was. Yeah. I don't like that me. I like the me that can sit and watch the full film. But but I think we can correct it, right? And that's definitely where my some of my efforts are. Is like, okay, I don't want to be someone just watching someone else do something. Like, to go participate, go do it. And then that's the goal of the whole short film thing, is like, how can I enable this how can I kind of kickstart this underground movement to get enough people being able to get enough money to make it worth doing this, not because the value's in how much you sell, but because you have to have money to eat so you can make stuff, right? So like it needs to at least break even. So how can I make people, give people that ability is sort of where my focus is right now.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, man, it's been a really good conversation. I feel like I should let you go. I think my wife is side eyeing me here for dinner, but we should talk again about the whole like quantum mechanics and AI. I think it'd be a really fun conversation. Sure. Thank you so much.
No, it's a big future. So yeah.
No, it's been great. Good luck, and I'll be keeping an eye out for whatever else you end up doing.